Have you ever known a child or young person who was clearly really bright, had great ideas, gave thoughtful responses to questions, but when it came time to completing tasks, that same kid just couldn't get things done? In today's episode, I'm going to talk about executive functioning. It's a big term for a lot of little things, and here's why it's important. Executive functioning impacts all aspects of learning, and it has a widespread role in everyday functioning and life. The other thing is that executive functioning is not explicitly taught in schools, yet it is typically expected that students will be able to figure it out on their own over time. But many do not. So let's jump in and talk about executive functioning.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 11. I was just looking at the calendar and I realized that this episode will air in January. And it is November right now when I'm recording, which means that by the time you hear this, it will be 2021. So happy New Year. And I am hoping for a fantastic 2021. 2020 was very difficult for so many people for so many different reasons. And I, like so many others, I'm hoping that 2021 will be a fantastic year. So I am so glad that you are listening. I love reading all your emails, messages, and thank you so much for sharing the episodes with others. So as you heard from the intro, today we are talking about executive functioning. It's a subject that I speak a great deal about. I actually wrote an article about executive functioning for the Child Nexus platform, and I will link to that article in the show notes. I spoke about executive functioning at the Help Group Summit in October. And more recently, I was a guest speaker for the West Los Angeles CHAD group. CHAD is Children and Adults with ADHD. And for that group, I spoke about the long-standing impacts of executive functioning struggles. So what I'd like to do is actually start with an example of an academic task that a student might be asked to complete. So the task is this. A teacher might say, I want you to write about an important woman in history and describe 3 reasons why her work was meaningful. So that task seems pretty simple, very straightforward. But if you dig a little deeper, it requires a number of different things. So the student has to organize her thoughts, organize them in an order that makes sense. The student has to research important figures in history, prioritize the information that they get, determine what's relevant and meaningful and what is not, and then they have to make a decision. They have to choose a woman to write about. They have to figure out a thesis statement, supporting ideas, create an outline, and then begin writing. And while the student is writing, the student has to remember the prompt, pay attention to spelling, grammar, punctuation, and if it's a time task, they have to be mindful of the time. They also probably have to edit and re-edit, summarize, and then go back and edit again. So that one task of writing about an important woman in history, describing 3 reasons why her work was meaningful, requires a number of different things. And that is really what executive functioning is like. So executive functioning refers to the ability to apply specific abilities to problem solving and ultimately to achieving goals. But executive functioning is really a broad umbrella term for a number of different things. So what I'd like to do is to talk about those things. Because when we talk about executive functioning, it can mean so many different things. And not everyone who struggles with executive functioning struggles with the same aspects of executive functioning. So one of the functions that makes up executive functioning is actually initiation. So what I mean by initiation is just getting started on a task. So task initiation is an executive function. And I've seen kids who struggle with this executive function because what that looks like, it looks like the student who is sitting in front of a blank page and will stare at that page for an extended period of time, and they just don't know where to start. Right? So they need a lot of support in just getting started on tasks. It can be an assignment. It can be homework. It can be a number of different things. But that simple task of initiation is an executive function that a number of kids struggle with. Another executive function is attentional control. And what I mean by that, that just means the ability to concentrate, to pay attention, to persevere and stay focused over an extended period of time. For many kids, they can focus for a short period of time, but it's that perseverance that's really the struggle. They have a hard time continuing with a task, particularly over an extended period of time. Another executive function, inhibition. What do I mean by that? I mean the ability to inhibit thoughts and actions that are inappropriate for a particular situation. So a child is sitting in the classroom. They have to be able to inhibit the people that are walking by outside the classroom, inhibit the bird that's building a nest on the windowsill, and then focus on what it is they need to be paying attention to. They also have to inhibit their own impulses. They may have thoughts that they want to express, right? And they have to hold themselves back and continue to listen to what the teacher's saying. They have to resist the impulse to just blurt out an answer and instead put up their hand, right? So they have to stop a behavior at an appropriate time. Another executive functioning is really the ability to kind of shift your focus from one thing to another. So it's really about shifting. It's about shifting your focus from one task to another, to alternate between different thoughts, different actions, different activities. So the ability to move from one thing to another. And what that might look like is a child who is really engaged in a novel, and then they have to shift their attention and focus on something else. They have to actually complete a math assignment. And some kids have a lot of difficulty kind of shifting to do another thing. So they need a lot of support in terms of making that transition and moving from one activity to another. What this also might look like is a child who gets so focused on one thing that they have a hard time kind of peeling themselves away from that one thing to do something else. And so that shifting can be an executive function where an area where some kids might struggle. Another one that's often impacted, and I see this a lot in kids who struggle with executive functioning, is planning. And if you think about planning, it involves setting a goal and determining the best way to reach that goal. And you often do this through a series of steps. And so that can be a difficult task for a number of kids. So the end goal might be a book report, but then you have to plan how to complete that book report by the time that it is due. And you have to plan all the things that need to be done to complete that task. And so that planning that's involved in completing and meeting a goal can be very difficult for a number of different students. And obviously, if you have poor planning, those are the kids and the adults who often procrastinate because they didn't put a good plan in place so that they can complete the task at the appropriate time. Another executive function is organization. And organization refers to the ability to bring order, basically, to information, to appreciate main ideas, key concepts, and really make sense of a lot of information. And organization can be the organization of your personal space so that you know where things are and you can retrieve those things when you need them. Think about your office or a bedroom or a place where kids are learning, their desk space. That organization, it can be a backpack in terms of how organized that backpack is. And so it's really about bringing order to a lot of information. Organization also can refer to your ability to bring order to a number of different tasks that you need to do. And planning and organization often go hand in hand. Organization can also, if you think about that prompt that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Organizing your writing. So if you think about the student who has a lot of great ideas, who knows what they have to write about, but they have to organize it and put all that information in a manner that makes sense and that is sequenced and that is organized in a way where people understand the beginning, the middle, and the end of what it is that they're trying to convey. So organization and planning are important executive functions, particularly for students in the classroom and when they're trying to get additional work done after school. Another executive function is working memory. Working memory refers to the capacity to hold information in your mind and manipulate it in order to complete a task, or to hold that information in your mind while you're generating goals. One example of working memory is doing math word problems in your head. So you're holding the details of the task. Johnny has 1 apple. His mom gives him 2 more and he drops 1. How many does he have left? So holding all of that information in your head, manipulating it, which is performing those math calculations and then giving a response. So that is a working memory task. Another one that is common in kids is when you give them a number of instructions. An example might be, you might tell a child, I want you to go upstairs, brush your teeth, put on your pajamas, and get a book for us to read. So the child has to hold that information in their mind while they're doing something else. And so you would hope that by the time you go upstairs, your child has teeth brushed, pajamas are on, and they have a book ready for you to read. And so that would be working memory. When individuals have struggles with working memory, they can often look very forgetful. That's the child who goes up the stairs intending to do all the things that they were told to do. And then mom goes upstairs and he's sitting on the floor playing with Lego, right? And so that would be an example of a working memory fail, where the child, again, had the intention of doing what he was supposed to do, but got distracted and wasn't able to hold that information in working memory while he was doing other things, like going up the stairs and trying to inhibit those enticing Lego that was on the floor. Another primary executive function is flexibility. Flexibility refers to the ability to switch your attention between 2 concepts. And more than just switching, it's really about thinking about things in different ways. And so an example would be a person or a child or a student who is trying to solve a problem, and they're trying to solve it in one way, and it is not working. And so being flexible in your thinking means that you realize that this strategy is not working, and then you flexibly think about another way to solve the problem, right? So it's about being flexible in your thinking. So something is not working. Can I do something else? Can I be more creative in my problem-solving strategies and think about doing things in a different way? So that's what we mean when we think about flexibility or cognitive flexibility. Another executive function that's often overlooked is self-regulation or emotional regulation. Sometimes people refer to it as self-control. What it really means is it refers to the ability to regulate your behavior, to regulate your thoughts and your emotions, and to appropriately modulate your actions and your mood. And so when kids struggle with self-regulation or emotional regulation, they often have these big feelings and they have a hard time controlling those feelings. And parents often describe those kids as very sensitive. Sometimes they say they don't know what's going to set them off. It can be something very small, but the child will have a big reaction to something very small. Oftentimes it's related to frustration, where the kids will have a very low frustration threshold. And the minute that something looks a little difficult, a little more challenging, that they feel that they can't solve a problem or do the work correctly, it can lead to a meltdown. And that emotional response is an example of a child having difficulty with emotional regulation or self-regulation. So they're really having a hard time kind of regulating their own mood and their own feelings. Oftentimes they struggle to kind of engage in that self-talk that we do to kind of soothe ourselves and to calm ourselves down when we are presented with things that are difficult for us, or kids who are disappointed in things, and so they have a hard time, again, controlling their emotions, controlling behaviors, controlling their reactions to things that they may not have control over. Another executive function is self-awareness, a child's ability to be aware of their behavior, aware of the way that their behavior is impacting other people. And that's kind of a higher level executive function. Other higher level executive functions are problem solving, reasoning, decision making, judgment. All of those things are executive functions. So what you see is that executive functioning is not one thing. It's a number of different things. So if we go back to the prompt that I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, it was, if you have a good working memory, you'll remember what the prompt was. It was about a teacher who instructed a student to write about an important woman in history and describe 3 reasons why her work was meaningful. So you can see that writing is an academic task that is most impacted by weak executive functioning skills. Because for a writing task, you need all of the things that we just described in terms of executive functioning. You think about it. Some of them are task initiation, just getting started on that writing task. While you're writing, persisting with that writing exercise, even if it seems boring. Inhibiting distractions. So inhibiting your brother, inhibiting people walking by, inhibiting the fire trucks that are driving by, inhibiting all of those things while you're completing the task. And then organizing and planning and executing that assignment. So there are a number of executive functions that are being utilized when you are completing a writing task. So we know that executive functioning is important for writing, but we also know that executive functioning enables children to focus. It helps them to remember information. If you think about working memory, it allows them to process information, and it actually predicts long-term and short-term success. So executive functioning is closely associated with the front part of the brain, that prefrontal cortex of the brain, and all of the prefrontal cortex's connections to other areas of the brain. And the good news is that the front part of the brain is the last part of the brain to develop. So over time, all kids get better at executive functioning skills, but some kids need more support in developing those skills than others. So what we know is that there are maturational changes in the brain structure and function over time. So executive functioning, as the brain develops, gets better over time. But we also know that there are social experiences that also shape and govern the development of executive functioning. And that's exciting because that means that there are things that we can do to help kids strengthen and develop those executive functioning skills. And I'm going to talk about some of those things. But I also want to emphasize that executive functioning is not only important for middle school and high school. I know I gave an example of a writing task. And when you hear that prompt, you're thinking middle school, high school, maybe some elementary schools. But we also know that executive functioning is an early predictor of success, even in kindergarten. So what the research shows is that kids who struggle with working memory and that cognitive flexibility that I mentioned, when they struggle with those things in preschool, those kids are more likely to experience difficulty in reading and math by the time they reach the first grade. And why is that important? It's important because young kids who experience learning difficulties in reading or math, they are at greater risk for having fewer educational and societal opportunities as they get older. They're more likely to struggle in school and in life. So if we know that these working memory difficulties, these difficulties with flexibility, and these difficulties with emotional regulation are predictors of academic success, then we can address them early on. And that's the good news. We know that those executive functioning difficulties are associated with neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD And they may also predict neurological disorders or neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD. We know that up to 90% of kids with ADHD also have executive functioning challenges, and many of those actually persist into adulthood. But there are also a number of students who do not have a formal diagnosis, but who are struggling with executive functioning. I'm thinking about all of the kids now who kind of transition to distance learning in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from parents and from educators are that students are being asked to use executive functioning even more now, particularly during that asynchronous learning time. So during that time, after the synchronous Zoom class ends, the students have to manage all of the different applications, the Seesaw and the Gigi and the Epic reading app, and all of those different things. They have to upload their work. They have to send it to the teacher. They have to check their Google Classroom account. They have to go back and check their email. They have to do a number of different things. They have to organize and plan and initiate all of those tasks on their own. They have to be flexible. They have to shift their focus from their math to their language arts assignment to their independent reading time. And that requires a great deal of executive functioning. So students who don't have a formal diagnosis can also struggle with executive functioning, and those students can also need some support. So one of the things I mentioned is, yes, the brain develops over time. The front part of the brain is the last part of the brain to develop. And we know that executive functioning is associated with that front part of the brain. Other regions as well, but closely associated with that frontal lobe. So yes, over time, those executive functions are going to get better. But are there things that we can do to have better executive functioning or to promote better executive functioning for our kids? Absolutely. Next week, we're going to talk about what things can be done in the context of educational therapy, but I do want to give you a few things that parents can do at home to support the development of executive functioning. One of the things we know from the research is that positive parenting, and by that I mean parents who show warmth and sensitivity and listen to the needs of their children, those parents tend to have kids who show better inhibition. So those kids are better able to inhibit distractions. They tend to have better sustained attention and better emotional regulation and self-control. When homes are well organized, children in those homes tend to have better organized workspaces, better organized backpacks, and they're better able to organize the tasks that they need to do at school. We also know that sleep is so critical for executive functioning skills for a number of different reasons. And I know that I talk about sleep a great deal, but it is important. When individuals get adequate sleep, they have better attention, which means that they are able to persist with tasks better over an extended period of time. They're also better able to inhibit distractions in their environment. When individuals have better sleep, their emotional regulation is better. They have better control over their thoughts, their emotions, and their mood is better. So we know that sleep is related to better executive functioning, adequate sleep. And so one of the things that parents can do is to make sure that kids, young people, are getting adequate sleep at night. For school-age children, it's typically between 10 and 12 hours of sleep a night. And it's critically important for the development of the brain, for attention, for alertness in the classroom, for being able to access your thinking. Think about what it's like to be able to think when you have not had adequate sleep at night. The research also shows that participation in sports, and not just aerobic exercise alone, it's really about participating in sports, is good for the development of executive functioning skills. And the reason for that is that if you think about sports, it requires sustaining attention. It requires working memory. Think about a person participating in sports. They have to remember and hold the rules of the game in their mind while they are playing the sport. You also have to be disciplined and purposeful. And all of those things are executive functioning skills that you develop as you are participating in those sports. The other thing about sports is that it's also a great opportunity for social bonding, which is helpful in improving mood. There has been a great deal of research on martial arts. And what they found is that children, for example, who participate in martial arts like Taekwondo have greater gains in their executive functioning skills over time. And what I think one research study that I was reading showed that when they compared kids who were in a Taekwondo class to kids who did not have that martial arts intervention, the kids in the Taekwondo class had better executive functioning skills in a number of executive functioning dimensions. And so it wasn't just in the ability to focus and to persist with focus. They had also had better emotional regulation, a better ability to inhibit distractions, and a better ability to organize their thoughts and ideas. And so it seems that martial arts, participation in sports, getting adequate sleep, having a well-organized home, family routines, and positive parenting, all of those things contribute to better executive functioning. We also know that cognitive behavioral therapy, educational therapy, and mindfulness are also very important and very helpful in helping kids address weaknesses in executive functioning. And it's not just kids. Adults also benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy and executive functioning coaching to address weaknesses in executive functioning. So what do we know? We know that executive functioning is a number of different things. It's an umbrella term for a lot of different things. And all of those things that fall under that umbrella of executive functioning are essential to many aspects of life. So not only academics, but also social skills, social interactions. Think about your ability to pay attention to another person when you're having a conversation and inhibiting what it is that you might be thinking about long enough to listen to what it is that they're saying. Right? So you're having a conversation, you're using your working memory to hold all the information that they're sharing with you. And then you are attending to what it is that they're saying and responding in an appropriate way. So executive functioning absolutely impacts academics, but it also impacts social functioning. And what we know from the literature is that executive functioning also impacts an individual's work environment, work ethics, and it actually is predictive of adult health outcomes later on. But I'll save that discussion for another time. So executive functioning is essential to many aspects of life. And the good news is that executive functioning can be improved. It can be improved with training and practice, and we'll talk about that next week. It can be improved by addressing environmental factors that contribute to executive functioning difficulties. And by that, I mean things like sleep. Those are things that we do have control over. Another thing that we have control over, to a certain extent, is stress. We know that stress can interfere with our ability to access those executive functions, to organize, to plan, to start tasks. And we can manage our stress with mindfulness, with therapy, with spending time outdoors, with engaging in interactions with other people. So those are things that we can do to minimize stress. And by addressing that environmental factor, which is stress, we can have better executive functioning. We can also develop strategies to compensate for executive functioning weaknesses. And we are definitely going to talk about that next week when we talk about educational therapy as a way of addressing executive functioning difficulties in children and adolescents. I hope that you have found this episode helpful, that you have a better understanding of executive functioning, what it is, and also feel hopeful about the fact that there are things that we can do to improve executive functioning. Please let me know what you thought about this episode. You can email me at drkiwilson@childnexus.com. I read all my emails, so tell me what you thought. And be sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already done so you don't miss next week's episode where I continue this discussion on executive functioning with educational therapist Hannah Ross. I hope that you are enjoying the show. I would be so thankful if you would pop over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to connecting again soon.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.